Long before you reach the gates, you can already see it rising from the flat plain of Mesopotamia, a city so immense that ancient travelers arriving from smaller kingdoms often described it with genuine disbelief. You are walking toward Babylon, sometime in the 6th century BC during the reign of King Nebuchadnezzar II, when the city stood at the very peak of its size, wealth, and power. The Euphrates River winds beside the road, its water diverted into countless irrigation channels, turning the surrounding desert into fields of barley and date palms, the true foundation of Mesopotamian civilization. The city walls appear first as a distant line on the horizon, then slowly reveal their true scale as you approach. Herodotus described Babylon's walls as so wide that 2 chariots could pass each other along the top side by side. Modern archaeologists consider some measurements exaggerated, though there is no doubt the walls were genuinely massive, thick enough and tall enough to make Babylon feel more like a fortress built to outlast empires. The road leading toward the gate grows increasingly crowded, filled with farmers driving carts loaded with barley, traders leading strings of pack donkeys weighed down with goods, and travelers on foot carrying little more than a staff. Guards stationed periodically along the approach observed the passing crowd, though for ordinary travelers, entry was a simple matter. As you draw closer, the famous Ishtar Gate comes into view, and it is unlike anything else in the ancient world. Its surface is covered entirely in glazed bricks of brilliant blue, decorated with rows of golden lions, bulls, and dragons. Excavations recovered enough original brickwork to reconstruct a full-scale version, proving how genuinely spectacular this entrance once was. Passing beneath the gate, you enter onto the processional way, a broad ceremonial road paved with limestone and breccia. The walls lining this road are decorated with over 100 lions in glazed relief, symbols of the goddess Ishtar. The noise strikes you next. Merchants calling out prices mix with the shouts of laborers and the creak of carts, and the distant chanting of priests somewhere near the city's sacred center. Babylon may have held a population approaching 200,000 people, making it one of the largest cities that had ever existed. This is not simply a city. It is a declaration of power carved permanently into brick and gold. At the center of Babylon rises a structure that would go on to inspire one of the most famous stories in human history, a massive stepped tower known as a ziggurat, called Etemenanki, meaning in ancient Sumerian, the temple of the foundation of heaven and earth. Standing at its base and looking upward, the structure seems to genuinely climb toward the sky, built in receding terraces of mud brick, each level slightly smaller than the one beneath it, rising toward a small temple at its summit dedicated to the chief god of Babylon, Marduk. Ancient texts describe the tower reaching a height of roughly 90 meters, comparable to a modern building of over 20 stories. Historians studying this structure widely believe Etemenanki served as the direct inspiration for the biblical story of the Tower of Babel, a connection supported by the tower's genuine height, its religious significance, and the multilingual, multicultural nature of Babylon itself, a city that, throughout its long history, brought together people speaking dozens of different languages under a single ruling power. The physical tower was real, but the specific story built around it belongs to legend and scripture, not to confirmed history. Priests moved through this sacred complex constantly, maintaining rituals considered absolutely essential to the stability of the kingdom itself. Babylonian religion was deeply interconnected with astronomy, and priests were also the ancient world's most sophisticated astronomers, tracking the movement of stars and planets with a level of mathematical precision, unmatched in most other civilizations for over 1,000 years. The temple complex extended across a considerable portion of the city center, including storage facilities for grain and valuable goods, workshops where craftsmen produced ritual objects, and living quarters for the substantial staff required to maintain daily worship. These religious institutions functioned simultaneously as centers of worship, significant landowners, and major employers, blurring the line between religious devotion and practical economic administration in ways that modern visitors find difficult to fully appreciate. Surviving cuneiform tablets preserved in the dry climate record decades of careful astronomical observation, eclipses, and planetary positions. One festival in particular, the New Year festival known as Akitu, involved days of ritual, procession, and public ceremony. During this festival, the king was required to submit to a ritual humiliation, struck by a priest and made to swear he had not neglected his duties. Above this sprawling complex, smoke rises from temple offerings, carrying the scent of burning incense and roasted grain across the streets. A smell so consistently present that ancient visitors to Babylon frequently mentioned it in their own written accounts of the city. Not far from the sacred precinct stands the royal palace of Nebuchadnezzar II, a structure whose sheer scale reflected the enormous administrative reach of the Babylonian Empire at its height. Approaching the palace walls, you notice a level of security and formality entirely absent from the ordinary streets outside. Guards stand at measured intervals, and officials move briskly between buildings carrying clay tablets covered in cuneiform script, the primary method of record-keeping across the entire Babylonian administration, used to track everything from tax collection and grain storage to legal disputes and diplomatic correspondence with distant kingdoms. Nebuchadnezzar himself ruled over an empire that, at its peak, stretched across much of the ancient Near East, and surviving royal inscriptions reveal a ruler deeply concerned with construction projects meant to demonstrate his power and piety simultaneously. Building inscriptions describe extensive palace renovations, new temple construction, and the reinforcement of Babylon's already formidable walls, all explicitly framed in the king's own words as acts of devotion to Marduk and the other gods of Babylon. The palace complex itself contained not only royal living quarters, but extensive administrative offices where scribes managed the practical business of running an empire. Babylonian bureaucracy was remarkably sophisticated for its era, maintaining detailed records of trade, taxation, and legal proceedings. Across a territory covering, at various points, much of modern Iraq, Syria, and parts of the wider region. It was also within royal courts like this one that Babylon's most famous legal tradition had originated centuries earlier, under King Hammurabi. Though Hammurabi ruled roughly 1,000 years before Nebuchadnezzar, his legal code remained a foundational reference point for Babylonian justice. The code addressed matters ranging from property disputes and labor contracts to family law and criminal punishment, applying different penalties based on social class in ways that reveal exactly how Babylonian society was structured and stratified. Diplomatic messengers from distant kingdoms occasionally passed through these palace halls as well, carrying clay tablets sealed with wax. Part of a surprisingly extensive international correspondence network, connecting Babylon to other major powers of the ancient Near East. Babylonian rulers engaged in genuinely sophisticated foreign policy, including marriage alliances, trade agreements, and formal treaties. The palace kitchens alone required a substantial permanent staff, preparing daily meals for the royal family, officials, and visiting dignitaries. Surviving ration lists describe daily allocations of bread, beer, meat, and oil distributed according to rank and position, offering historians a genuinely detailed picture of exactly how a royal household of this scale organized its daily provisioning. Standing within this palace, surrounded by administrators, guards, priests, and foreign envoys, it becomes clear that Babylon's power rested on organization. Its strength was found in its extraordinarily organized system of law, record-keeping, and governance. Among all the wonders attributed to Babylon, none has captured human imagination quite like the Hanging Gardens, and none carries quite so much historical uncertainty. According to later Greek and Roman writers, the Hanging Gardens consisted of an extraordinary series of terraced gardens, rising in tiers and supported on massive stone columns. These gardens were irrigated by a sophisticated system said to lift water from the Euphrates River to the topmost level. Ancient descriptions speak of exotic trees and cascading greenery, arranged to resemble a lush, artificial mountain rising unexpectedly from the flat Mesopotamian landscape. A garden built, according to legend, by Nebuchadnezzar for a homesick wife who missed the green hills of her native land. Here, historical honesty becomes essential. Despite extensive archaeological excavation at the site of Babylon, no definitive physical evidence of the gardens has ever been discovered. This absence has led to genuine, ongoing scholarly debate. Some historians argue the gardens existed, but were destroyed so thoroughly that no trace survived. Others propose the gardens may have actually stood in the Assyrian city of Nineveh, pointing to detailed garden descriptions confirmed archaeologically at that separate site. A smaller number of scholars question whether the gardens existed at all, suggesting the story may have grown from a real but far more modest royal garden. What can be said is this: Mesopotamian rulers did maintain elaborate royal gardens as a symbol of power and divine favor, and Babylonian engineers possessed the genuine hydraulic knowledge necessary to construct sophisticated irrigation systems capable of watering elevated terraces. Whether the specific, towering garden described by later legend existed exactly as told remains, honestly, one of history's genuine unsolved mysteries. Walking near where such gardens might once have stood, it is worth pausing on this uncertainty. Not every wonder left behind physical proof. Sometimes what survives is only the story itself, passed from writer to writer until the line between witness and imagination becomes impossible to untangle. Away from the temples and palaces, Babylon's true daily economic life unfolds along the banks of the Euphrates River. Boats arrive constantly, loaded with goods drawn from a trade network stretching across much of the ancient Near East. The river functioned as Babylon's primary highway, far more efficient for moving heavy cargo than overland routes through the surrounding desert. Flat-bottomed boats, constructed from reed bundles coated in bitumen, carried grain, wool, dates, timber, and pottery between Babylon and distant settlements. At the riverside markets, the noise and activity rival anything found in the city's ceremonial center. Merchants call out prices in multiple languages, reflecting Babylon's position as a genuine crossroads of cultures within its vast empire. Textiles dyed in rich colors hang alongside pottery, carved ivory, and metalwork. Some crafted locally, others carried from distant regions like Persia. Silver served as the primary medium of exchange, typically weighed rather than minted, requiring merchants to carry small scales and weights. Surviving cuneiform tablets document loan agreements and trade contracts with a level of legal precision that historians find genuinely impressive. Date palms line the riverbanks in extensive groves, providing food and material for rope, making them economically essential plants. Barley grew across vast irrigated fields, harvested and stored in state granaries to maintain food security during years of poor rainfall. Craftsmen worked in workshop districts near the markets, producing pottery, textiles, and metalwork for both local use and export. Potters shaped clay vessels on simple wheels before firing them in kilns fueled by dried reeds, as timber was a scarce resource. Women played an active role, documenting female merchants and property owners operating within Babylonian commercial law. By midday, the markets reached their peak, a snapshot of the labor that sustained Babylon's famous monuments and legends. Babylon's reputation as a center of law and order rested on a legal tradition considered remarkably advanced by the standards of its era. One whose most famous expression, the Code of Hammurabi, remains among the most significant surviving legal documents from the ancient world. Carved into a massive stone stele, later discovered by archaeologists in the early 20th century, at the site of Susa. The Code of Hammurabi contains nearly 300 specific legal provisions, covering matters ranging from property disputes and inheritance to labor contracts and criminal punishment. The code is famous for its principle of proportional retribution, often summarized by the phrase, "an eye for an eye." However, punishments varied significantly depending on social class, revealing a system structured around hierarchy rather than treating all citizens as equal. By the time of Nebuchadnezzar, centuries later, these principles remained deeply embedded in society, even as the legal tradition evolved. Local courts handled everyday disputes, where witnesses, written contracts, and formal testimony played genuine roles in legal proceedings. Surviving court records document real cases like property disputes and fraud, offering a window into ordinary Babylonian daily life. Marriage itself, operated as a formal legal contract, with tablets recording dowry agreements, inheritance rights, and even provisions for divorce. Divorce was permitted under specific circumstances, though its practical consequences typically fell more heavily on women within this patriarchal structure. Babylonian courts also addressed commercial disputes involving fraudulent partnerships and disagreements over the quality of goods. Judges, typically respected local citizens, weighed testimony and written evidence before rendering decisions recorded on clay for a permanent archive. Slavery existed as well, but law permitted enslaved individuals to own property, engage in business, and sometimes purchase their own freedom. Babylon's legal sophistication lived in the daily arguments, contracts, and negotiations of ordinary people trying to resolve very human disagreements. Beyond the temples, palaces, and grand ceremonial roads, most of Babylon's population lived lives defined by considerably more modest, though no less significant daily routines. Ordinary Babylonian homes, based on archaeological excavations, were typically constructed from mud brick, organized around a central courtyard that provided light, ventilation, and space for activities. Multiple generations shared these homes, reflecting an extended family structure that provided both economic security and mutual support in the absence of a social safety net. Daily meals centered around barley bread and porridge, supplemented with vegetables, dates, and, for those who could afford it, fish drawn from the Euphrates River. Meat remained a luxury reserved for religious festivals, a dietary pattern consistent across ancient civilizations. Beer, brewed from barley, was a daily staple for everyone. Household work fell disproportionately to women, who managed food preparation, textile production, and child-rearing alongside participation in small-scale trade or craft production. Surviving records indicate Babylonian women could own property and engage in business transactions, rights that exceeded the legal standing granted to women in many other civilizations. Children contributed to family labor from a young age, whether assisting with agricultural work, learning a trade, or, for a fortunate few, receiving formal education. Education remained largely restricted to boys from wealthier families, as formal literacy required years of training in the complex and expensive cuneiform writing system. Clothing for ordinary Babylonians was simple wool or linen, starkly contrasting the elaborately dyed and decorated garments worn by royalty and priests found in palace records. Jewelry for ordinary families tended toward simple metal or shell ornaments, while elaborate gold and precious stones were reserved strictly for the genuinely wealthy elite. Despite economic hierarchies, daily religious practice was woven into household life through small shrines and amulets, intended to ward off illness or misfortune. For commoners, the gods of Babylon were not simply distant figures, but constant, intimate presences, woven directly into the fabric of everyday survival. Few achievements define Babylonian civilization quite as fundamentally as its system of writing, a technology that had already existed for 1,000 years. By the height of Babylon's power, Babylonian scribes continued to develop, refine, and preserve this essential craft. Cuneiform writing, pressed into soft clay tablets using a reed stylus, required years of dedicated training to master properly. Archaeological excavations of scribal schools, known as aduba, or tablet houses, have uncovered countless practice tablets left behind by young students. This revealed a formal education system that included repeated copying exercises, mathematical training, and the memorization of traditional literary and religious texts. The sheer range of surviving cuneiform documents offers historians an extraordinarily detailed window into nearly every aspect of Babylonian life. Beyond legal contracts, archaeologists have recovered personal letters and medical texts, describing treatments and diagnoses. Others include mathematical tablets demonstrating sophisticated calculation methods, including early forms of algebra and detailed astronomical records. These records tracked celestial movements across multiple generations of careful observation, marking an enduring intellectual legacy. Babylonian scribes worked within a base 60 numbering system, remarkably practical for complex division and fractional calculation. Surviving tablets reveal solutions to quadratic equations and geometric problems, demonstrating a level of abstract reasoning remarkable for its time. Among the most significant literary works is the Epic of Gilgamesh, a narrative poem exploring themes of friendship and mortality. Surviving versions reveal a rich philosophical tradition, comparable in significance to the great epic literature of ancient Greece. Scribes occupied a respected position, serving as judges, physicians, and royal advisors within Babylonian society. Their literacy granted them access to influence and responsibility that remained largely closed to the illiterate majority. Some scribal families maintained their profession across generations, passing skills and knowledge from father to son. Babylon's true legacy may rest in this quiet transmission of knowledge, a system sophisticated enough to preserve wisdom across centuries. Ultimately, it survived buried in clay for archaeologists to rediscover thousands of years after Babylon itself had fallen silent. Religion in Babylon was never a separate occasional practice set apart from daily life. It was woven directly into government, law, science, and the personal routines of nearly every resident of the city, from the king himself down to the humblest household. Marduk stood as the chief deity of the Babylonian pantheon, a position he had gradually risen to over centuries, reflecting Babylon's own growing political dominance across Mesopotamia. According to Babylonian religious tradition, Marduk had earned his supreme status by defeating Tiamat, a primordial goddess of chaos, in a great cosmic battle recorded in a religious text known as the Enuma Elish, a creation narrative recited publicly during major religious festivals, reinforcing Babylon's central place within the very structure of the universe as Babylonians themselves understood it. Beyond Marduk, Babylonians recognized an extensive pantheon of gods and goddesses, each associated with specific aspects of life, nature, and fate. Ishtar, goddess of love, fertility, and war, held particular prominence, her symbol, the lion, appearing prominently throughout the city's most sacred processional route. Shamash, god of the sun and justice, was closely associated with the legal system itself, invoked in oaths and legal proceedings as a divine witness to human agreements and disputes. Priests serving these deities occupied a distinct and genuinely powerful social class, managing not only religious ritual, but also substantial temple estates, which functioned as major economic institutions in their own right, controlling significant agricultural land, employing considerable labor forces, and engaging directly in trade and commerce alongside their religious responsibilities. Astrology and astronomy remained deeply intertwined within Babylonian religious practice, with priests carefully tracking celestial movements, not purely from scientific curiosity, but from genuine belief that the positions of stars and planets carried direct significance for royal decision-making, agricultural timing, and the broader fate of the kingdom. This sustained methodical observation, maintained across many generations, produced genuinely accurate astronomical records and mathematical models that later Greek astronomers would eventually draw upon directly, representing one of Babylon's most significant and enduring intellectual contributions. Temples also served practical medical functions within Babylonian society, since illness was widely understood as connected to divine will, or the influence of malevolent spirits. Physicians, some operating within temple settings and others practicing more independently, combined ritual and herbal remedies in their treatment of patients, and surviving medical tablets record detailed diagnostic observations, alongside prescribed treatments, revealing a medical tradition that, while rooted in religious belief, nonetheless demonstrated careful, systematic observation. Personal religious practice extended well beyond temple worship into the intimate details of ordinary life. Babylonians commonly consulted diviners before major decisions, wore protective amulets against illness and misfortune, and maintained small household shrines dedicated to personal or family deities, revealing a worldview in which the boundary between the sacred and the everyday was in practice remarkably thin. As evening settles over the city, torches and oil lamps begin flickering to life across Babylon's streets, temples, and palace halls. The last merchants close their stalls along the riverside markets, and priests complete their final rituals at the base of the great ziggurat. Babylon's dominance would not last forever. Within a few generations, the city fell to the Persian Empire under Cyrus the Great. This transition of power did not immediately erase the city's significance. Babylon continued to function as a major city for centuries afterward. However, it gradually declined in political importance as new centers of power emerged elsewhere in the region. Over centuries, changing river courses and the abandonment of its structures left Babylon buried beneath its own accumulated ruins. By the 19th century, much of the city lay hidden beneath layers of collapse, waiting to be carefully uncovered piece by piece. What archaeologists eventually recovered exceeded even the expectations built up through centuries of biblical and classical references to its status. The Ishtar Gate, reconstructed from thousands of glazed bricks, now stands in a Berlin museum, offering visitors contact with Babylon's achievement. Thousands of recovered cuneiform tablets continue to be studied, expanding our understanding of Babylonian law, science, literature, and daily life. Babylonian mathematics survives today in the modern division of hours into 60 minutes and circles into 360 degrees. Astronomical records provided a foundation for Greek astronomers, while the Code of Hammurabi remains a significant attempt to codify formal law. Standing among the excavated ruins of Babylon today, walking across ground once covered by grand ceremonial roads, the weight of history is clear. A city so advanced and confident that its very name became, for thousands of years, a universal symbol of grandeur itself. Empires believed themselves eternal. Babylon believed this most of all. And yet, the desert eventually claimed even this. History does not spare the greatest cities any more gently than the smallest villages. It simply waits for someone willing to walk through the ruins and relive what was once believed unforgettable.